Does the Yashica FX3 offer a viable option when it comes to selecting a 35mm film camera? I'm photographer Phil Meadows, and this is I Shoot on 20 Film, a channel dedicated to film photography. So I've had this camera a couple of years now. I can't even remember where I acquired it from, to be honest with you. It was in pretty tired state, it was very dirty, and it seemed to be functioning quite well. The shutter was working, the aperturing was working, the focusing was smooth. But I just threw it in a box, and I thought, you know, one day I'll get that out and clean it up and take a look at it. So that's what I did last week. So the cover material on these old Yashicas are notorious for getting pretty gnarly. They go very very spongy, flaky, pretty nasty. So I took that off and I gave it a good clean, and to give it a little bit of character I took some wire wool and just a little bit of brassing on the base plate there. So this base plate appears to be brass or some kind of alloy, and the rest of it is quite plasticky. I'm not really quite sure. There's quite a bit of metal in it, but the top is definitely plastic. It is very light, and it's quite comfortable in the hand, and it's also very small. I would say it's in the same size and weight as the little Olympus OM series. So on that basis, it certainly is. It checks a lot of boxes. It's very nice. Now, one of the very nice things about these Yashicas is that it uses the Yashica bayonet or the Contax bayonet mount, and there are a lot of fans who really love that Contax glass. Very, very nice quality glass. It's still expensive even today. You'll still pay, you know, £200, £300, £400 for some of those lenses. It's sort of suggested that the Yashica lens is or comes out of the same factory. I don't really know about that. I haven't looked into that, to be honest with you. But what I can tell you is I found it to be, you know, a nice piece of glass. It renders quite nice. Is it the best? Yeah, that's subjective, but you know, it did its job. It was really nice, and focuses very, very nicely too. So let's put that back on there. So apart from the body being very light, the shutter action on it is a little clunky. On this particular model, it does. I did everything else. I sorted it all out. It works great. It does need new seals on the back door, and I suspect that it also needs a new little mirror damper right in the top there, which I'll do, and that should quieten it down. But it is a little clunky, a little noisy at the moment, but it did shoot great. Now, I went to a car boot sale, and I found a little point and shoot camera, and taped to that point and shoot camera was a roll of Fuji Superia 200. I think it dated to 2008, obviously well out of date. I presume it had not really been stored in any particularly favorable conditions, but I paid £1 for it. I thought, you know, I think I'll throw that roll of film into this camera and have a little bit of fun. So that's what I did. And these were the negatives right here. So I did notice on some of the negatives that there were some light leak issues on about 3 or 4 of the shots. So that did confirm to me that it did in fact need a new light seal kit. But there's also the majority of the images were fine. So on that note, I did take a look at some of the negatives. I scanned them on an Epson 600 flatbed, and so let's go ahead and do that right now. Take a look at a couple of the images, and then I'll show you how I scan them on the Epson scanner and the Epson software. So I've already got this negative strip preview pre-scanned here, and I'm just going to select this this particular frame, and I'm going to zoom in on this button here. I like to zoom in so I can actually see the a sort of a bigger preview, if you like, of the actual negative, and then I can crop it a little tighter so as not to lose any of the image. Okay, so you can see there I've got a little bit more room to play with, and I'll pull that out just a little bit. Now, I just want to go through some of my process, my setup. Now, I've seen there's a lot of people, you know, do this many different ways. On 35mm film, this is how I prefer to do it. If I am scanning 120 negative film, I do it a little bit differently. But for now, I just want to demonstrate what I think is a very simple and efficient way of getting a nice scan with some very nice colors. So just in the setup area, first of all, I just want to confirm I'm in the professional mode. And I've got the color negative option set here. So color negative, I've got it in 48-bit color, and I select a resolution of 3200. Now that is, I think, the upper limit for 35mm. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set the unsharp mask to low. Now I know a lot of people do suggest that they turn off the unsharp mask and turn off all the other corrections, but I found, particularly with, as I said, with the 35mm film, that if I set a low unsharp mask element, and also in the grain reduction I set a low setting there, and in dust removal I also set a low dust removal setting. So low, low, and low. Now the other thing I want to do is go into the configuration, and this is something I don't see people talk about, but I think it's very important, because you get, if you don't work in the same color space as your editing software, you can get some problems. And I know that a lot of people complain about seeing, you know, color shifts or hue shifts, and this will to some degree eliminate some of those problems. So at least you're staying within some kind of a color space. So I like to, by default, it will probably look like this when you open this configuration. And by my settings, I go into color sync, and I set this target to Adobe RGB, okay? And the source obviously is the Epson scanner. So this is Adobe RGB, and I've also got my Photoshop set to Adobe RGB. Now Lightroom, if you're working on Lightroom color space is set to Pro Photo. But I'm going to work this in Photoshop, and if I were coming out of Lightroom to Photoshop to do this, then I would have my Photoshop likely set in Pro Photo to match the color space in Lightroom if I were doing some editing there and doing some round tripping. But to keep things simple, Adobe RGB will match my color space in Photoshop. So with that set, I'll close that. And now what I do here, again, some people like to do this. I've seen them on the output slider. They like to pull everything to the left and to the right. And then I notice people do things kind of like this, and they're talking about getting a flat scan. And you can see, you know, some things are happening. However, what I prefer to do is, again, this is for 35mm scan, is hit the auto exposure setting. And that gets us pretty darn close. Okay, let the software do a little bit of lifting. Now, once we have the auto setting here, we then want to go down and pick this little, it's a densitometer and it's a little magnifying glass. So we click on this and pull up this densitometer. Now what we're going to do now is, with the levels adjustment, we're going to very carefully target our highlights, midtones and shadows. And again, so we're going to let the software do a little bit of the lifting. Okay, so if we drop into our shadow area, you can see up on the top here, you can see these numbers, the red, green and blue, and the luminance channel. So if we drop into the shadows, that indicates that we've got values of 21, 21 and 15 in the red, green and blue. So that's a little brighter, and what we could do with that is pull that down just a little bit, and you can have a look, and we see now we've got 24, 29, 31. Maybe pop that down some more. That's starting to open up that a little bit more, and let's take a look at some of the brighter elements out here. 230, 235, 237. Okay, so what I'm also looking for is anything that might be neutral in the image. There's not much that's really neutral in here, but as a guide, but on the lighter areas, it's not bad. You know, you can see that we've got on the luminance channel 244, so it's within a nice range. I like to work at sort of 245 on my brights, and if I were to move this, then that will change things a little bit for me to 200. So I'm just going to pull that in. Okay, now this obviously is representing your highlights, and as I said, a lot of people like to pull these out, but that means you've then got to go in and start doing some more correction in Photoshop. So let's take these down just a smidge, and there we go, about 247. So that'll do for now. Okay, so a quick look at make sure we're not clipping any of these red, green and blue channels, which we're not. And now we're going to set our destination, and we'll scan it as an image format type as a TIFF. And we'll call this leaves FX3 for want of any other file name type. And we'll set this at 001, and then we're going to save it to the desktop. You can choose the file to save it to in here, but we'll just go straight to the desktop and we'll click OK. So now with the image in Photoshop, you can see that the colors are quite nice. The greens are kind of as you would expect. The browns are sort of a nice golden brown. It looks kind of how I remember it. There's nothing kind of really funny going on with the colors here. So what I'm going to do is, rather than with a curve set there, I'm going to use selective color. And pretty much all I do is use a selective color layer, a curves layer, and then I put some high pass sharpening to the file. So let's have a look then at the selective color. So if we go into, say, the reds, and if you don't know what these sliders do, then don't really worry about it. Just take hold of the slider, go through the different color areas, you know, from reds, yellow, greens, cyans, blues, etc., and just play with them. So to drop it down to cyan and all the way up to positive on the cyan, you can see how that makes a huge difference in the red. So we're going to reduce the cyan in the reds and give that just a little bit, and you can see it's not really doing anything to the greens, it's just working on the reds. Now that's looking quite nice. So what about in the neutrals? So I would, again, if you have a cyan cast to your image, then, you know, go into your cyans and move these sliders around and see what you can find. Well, obviously, you know, there is not really any sort of cyan cast to be worrying about there. So I'm just going to cancel that out, zero that out, and there we go. If we move into the black, nope, nothing happening there. So just have fun with these sliders. Doesn't really matter if you understand color theory, it doesn't matter. So let's go down to neutrals. This is always an interesting one. And now we can actually, whatever the neutral areas of the image are, we can really play with those and try and get something that looks kind of realistic. So we have the magentas in there. Sometimes you'll get a magenta cast or a pinky looking hue to a scan. A lot of people make reference to, especially when scanning Ektar. That does occur quite frequently with a lot of feedback that I've had from people. So they get a pinkish tint to their Ektar scans, and how can they rectify it? And this is one of the ways that you can deal with that. Moving the yellow slider around, well, that would put something, well, we'll just give it a little bit there. And the blacks, this is obviously just going to change the density of the blacks, and we don't want to kind of mess with that too much, but that looks okay. Now, if you look at this info tool, I work with this very, very closely. Now, the way to pull up the info tool is by holding down the shift key and clicking, take your color picker here, click into an area of, let's say, deep shadow, and the dark shadow would be in here. Hold down the shift key and click, and you can see now that we've got this number 1 dropper, and that's showing you the red, green and blue values as what they were originally and what they are now. So if you were to make changes in this selective color slider, you can now see that you are changing those values. Now, typically, you can use this to create or find color casts in your images by finding something that's neutral. So if we make another one by holding down Shift, and we click on something that is a little lighter, and we're going to create another one of number 2, and it sits there. And it also gives you a very accurate idea of where your histogram lays on that particular portion of that image. You can see we've got 225, 228 and 241. And if we were to now put a curve onto that, if you take a look at what happens here, because we're working on this number 2, and I push that, you'll see that on that highlight area, we can actually push that up, and it gives you a very good indication as to where your lights and darks are sitting. Okay, so you can really play with that. You get a nice adjustment. out of that. And you can also take a look at the effect on the number one info picker, which is right here in the deep shadows. So we could bring this down and create a little bit more contrast, but you can see you're not actually blocking it up. Now, this is important. I print a lot. I'm a big believer in, if you've seen some of my previous videos, you'll know that I am a real advocate for printing. So this is very important to me because I want to make sure that I get the density right on my images. But when it comes to printing, it's going to make my life a lot easier. It is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to bring detail back from something that's kind of too blocked up. So I like to use numbers. Numbers are, you know, it's mathematical. Whether your screen is calibrated or not, it doesn't really matter. The numbers don't lie. So I always use this system whenever I'm doing color corrections to any image, or I'm doing curves or levels or whatever I'm working with. I always work this way. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me, and so we'll leave that right there. So the next thing I'll do is I'll just merge these layers down together, Shift Command E. I'm kind of done with that, and let's put a high pass filter onto this now. So I go to Filter, Other, High Pass on 35mm frames. I just do a very, very small radius, and let's maybe just go down to, I just want to be able to see the edges, if you like. I just want to be able to see the edges. You can just see them kind of poking through there. And give that an OK. On the style here, I'm going to go down to Overlay. And now that still doesn't look, I would go to 50% maybe to take a look at this. As you can see, it still doesn't look very sharp. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do it again. Command J, and I'm just going to copy that sharpening process. And I'll just maybe 2 copies is all you need, and if it gets a little bit too much, you can just back off on one, and I'll go back down to 25%. That just doesn't look too bad. Okay, so my methodology for scanning, I like to do things in 3 parts. So if I were shooting digital, I would import my file. I'd be applying a very small amount of sharpening to the image. I would then be preparing the image at the print size and putting another sharpening process to that before I save the file, and then I'd be doing a print sharpening. And I'm pretty much doing the same thing here. So this would be a 2-step. So if I were to then output this, this would be the working file, if you like, and I'd be happy with this as a scan. So I would save this, and then depending on how I was going to output it, I'd then put another round of sharpening on it. Okay, so again, I'm just going to merge these down. I'm pretty happy with it. Some of you may prefer to keep your layers or whatever. You've got different ways of doing things. I'm just doing this as a demonstration. I'm not being too pedantic about the whole thing. So one of the things I do is, depending on different lighting scenarios, when I'm shooting film, and I'm particularly working with Ectar 100 at the moment, is I take my X-Rite color checker passport, and I'll take a photograph in that lighting scenario, just as I would if I was shooting digital. And that gives me a good, solid, neutral point. Yes, it wastes a frame, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're shooting 35mm, what is one frame? If you're shooting medium format, it's part of the process. You know, it's an expensive format to shoot, but my workflow in particular, yours may vary. I'm actually looking to do quality work. So it is worth it to me to sacrifice one frame so that I have a good solid base to work with when it comes to having a neutral, and then being able to gauge where my colors are without kind of guessing, especially if I can't find a neutral in my image. So that's just a little tip. Try it if you want to give that a go, but it really does work. It also would, it's very, very helpful when you are scanning to actually try scanning a shot of a color checker card or even a neutral gray card, and using that selective color and using the color picker points, work out how to find a neutral. Just look at your red, green, and blue values and your luminance channel and just have a look and just find those neutrals, and you'll be amazed how simple scanning and color correction from scans actually becomes doing that. So onwards a little bit. So what did I think to this little camera? The pros and the cons, if you like. Well, definitely a pro, very, very lightweight. Very simple to use. It's all manual, doesn't require batteries. It takes a small battery here, the LR44, which is for the light meter. It's a simple red and a green LED in the viewfinder. There's nothing else in there that you need to be bothered with. The lens is quite sharp. It didn't seem to be affected very much with extraneous light. It didn't flare. All these images that I shot were on a sort of a misty morning, which can induce some lens flare I've found in the past, but it seemed to handle that quite well. This is the FX3 Super. With the maximum shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, you can get the FX3 2000, which has one stop faster on the shutter speed, which might be nice if you're shooting 400 speed film, or you're shooting 800 and you want to use a much shallower depth of field by opening your aperture to, you know, the 2.8 or whatever. Other than that, yeah, for a light camera, very robust. So if you've got any thoughts or comments on this camera or film photography in general, or scanning, whatever, hit me up on the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel. It's a new channel. It takes some time to get some traction with it. I've been trying to get some other videos out, in particular a series that I'm working on photographing some local churches. That's been a bit of a challenge, but I'm getting there with that one. And other things coming up, I've got a new website that is almost ready to go, and also a Facebook group, which I will give more details about in the next video, which should be about a week's time. So please subscribe to the channel. Hope to see you again, and thank you for giving your time.